Hey everyone, and welcome to my Svelte tutorial. In this tutorial, what we're going to be building is a very simple movie journal. You're going to be able to enter in movies that you've seen and then rate them on a scale of 1 to 5. You're also going to be able to search through these results so that you can look back on the movies that you've seen and see how much you've enjoyed them. This is a super simple application. Instead of doing a to-do app, I've decided to do this because I feel like the to-do app thing has been a little bit overused, and this goes over a lot of the same concepts as a to-do app, and I think it's plenty for you to understand how Svelte works at a beginner level. Now, if you're not familiar with what Svelte is, it is a front-end framework that's very different from React and Angular and Vue. It's sort of a newer approach to front-end frameworks. It does not ship with a virtual DOM. It instead compiles the application completely into vanilla JavaScript. Now, I have a podcast episode where I talk all about Svelte and I compare it to React, Angular, and Vue. It's located right here. If you go to portexe/cast/1, you'll see that you can watch it on YouTube, SoundCloud, and Spotify. Now, that was my very first podcast episode, so kind of bear with it, but it'll give you all the information you need about Svelte. I'll leave a link in the description below if you'd like to check that episode out. Now, if you want to support my channel, the best thing you can do right now is to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get into this tutorial. So the quick start here is we're going to use npx dgit. We're basically going to post this line of code into our terminal. So I've got my terminal window open and I'm going to paste in the line of code that I copied from the docs. I'm going to remove this very last part because that's what you want to name the project, and I'm going to name this Movie Journal. When I press enter, it's going to clone the repository and then create a folder called Movie Journal, and if I cd into it and ls, you can see that all of the files for a normal project are in there already. Now I want to go ahead and open this up with my VS Code so I can see the files that exist inside of here. Let's talk a little bit about the overall structure of how a Svelte project is laid out. So on the left, if we look, we have a public folder, a scripts folder, a source folder, a package.json, a readme, which just has information, a rollup.config, and of course a gitignore. Let's have a look at the package.json. We have 3 scripts in here: build, dev, and start. We're going to be using dev in this tutorial, so we're going to run npm run dev in order to get the development server up and running so that we can develop our project. And as you can see, it uses rollup. And what this is saying is it's going to compile the application. And then this -w flag is saying watch. So every time you make a change and you save, it's going to recompile the application and then load it back into the browser. So that's the command we're definitely going to be using throughout this tutorial. Now, if you look at our dependencies, you can see we have a bunch of rollup dependencies. Now, rollup is a build tool that this project is using in order to compile the application into just normal JavaScript. Then the only other dependency is Svelte. So definitely read up a bit on rollup and see how that works if you're interested. Otherwise, you really don't need to know how it works, especially for this tutorial, because we're just going to be running the commands here, and Svelte has handled all of that for you. Now let's have a look inside of the source folder. Inside of the source folder, we have 2 files, app.svelte and main.js. Main.js has an app variable, and it's creating a new app object. The very first property in this object is document.body. Now what this is basically saying is we're going to take our entire app, whatever we're importing here from our app.svelte file, and we want to put it inside of the document.body. And that document.body is talking about the index.html file inside of the public folder. So let's open that up. Let's look inside of this HTML file and notice that there's nothing between the body tags. Well, let's put something between the body tags here for a moment, just so we can have a look. So I've put a div in here and I'm gonna give it a class name. I'm gonna give it a class of root, just so we can look at it inside of the DOM. And I'm gonna run this project. But before I run the project, I have to run npm install in order to get all of my dependencies installed. So npm install, that will take just a moment. Now I can run npm run dev to run the development server. You can see it was up very quickly. I'm just going to copy this URL and go to it here in my browser, and we see a very simple hello world. Now I'm going to right click, go to my console here, go to my inspector. Here you can see that div that I created inside of that index.html file with the class of root. Now as you can see, the app itself was put inside of the body tag and not inside of the root. That is because inside of the main.js file, we're injecting it inside of the body. You can actually change this to document.getElementById, put root in here, go back to the HTML file and change this from a class to an ID. And when you save both of these files and we go back, you can see that the app is now being injected inside of the div here with the ID of root. So basically what that means is you can put your app inside of anywhere you want. So if you have a larger application you can set your target to really be anything you want. But I just wanted to demonstrate that. We're actually going to put this back the way that it was, and I'm going to remove the div from the index.html file and save all of this and just return to how things were from the get-go. So if we go back to the code, there's the second property. So the first property was target, and the second property is props. And what this is saying is it's going to pass any props you pass into this app component. So this file is bootstrapping the application, and we're defining a variable here called app, and we're creating an object from the file that we're importing here, which is our app.svelte. So you can kind of think of app.svelte as the entry point for your application, and main.js is the bootstrapping file that brings it to life. So the second property here being props is a object, and you can pass in some properties to the entry point. So let's have a look inside of app.svelte. You can see that it accepts the name variable that we're passing in as a prop here. It accepts it right here, and then it uses it inside of this h1 tag. So hello name, and if you look in the main.js file, we're setting name to world, and we're saying hello name here. When we look at the browser, you can see it says hello world. So if I change this from world to internet and save it, you can see now this variable has changed to internet because that's the variable we're using right here. Now let's say we wanted to add another property. We could put a comma, put a new property name, anything you want to name it, as long as it's a valid JavaScript property name. And here I'm just going to say hi. Now, if I go inside of here, I have to do the same thing that they're doing here with name. I have to accept it here. And we named that new prop. So export let new prop. That's what we're doing here. Now, underneath this, I want to use that, and I'll put it inside of an h3 tag. I'm using the curly braces, and anything between the curly braces, I can put some JavaScript. This is very similar to React. So I'm going to go ahead and put new prop. Save, and you can see the variable is now there. So as you can see, we can pass props down, but let's have a look at what the syntax is here. It's a little bit different than probably what you're used to, especially if you're coming from other frameworks, such as React or Angular. Anything you write inside of here is going to be similar to just a normal HTML file. So you can just write plain HTML in here, but you can also put script tags, and you can write JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript inside of these script tags. And then you can use the JavaScript that you write inside of your HTML by interpolating using these curly braces. You can also put styles. Now, any styles you write inside of this file will apply only to the elements inside of this file. So here we're using a main tag, and here we're using the main selector to style that main. But if we had a main inside of another component, these styles would not affect the main outside of this component whatsoever. So it basically is it's very similar to CSS modules in the sense that the styles here are encapsulated to this component only. Now, if you want to have global styles, inside of the public folder is a global.css file where you can write global styles if you want to. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get rid of a little bit of these styles because this is obviously for the boilerplate code that they've included, and we really don't want this stuff. So I'm gonna get rid of this, and I'm gonna keep this just because I like the color that it provides us, and I like the font size overall for the header. And I'm gonna get rid of the main, and instead I'm gonna put a class name called main. And I'm gonna change our container here from being a main to a div with a class of main. Now, if I have a div with the class of main outside of this file in a different component, any styles I put here will not affect those. That will only affect the styles of the div with the class of main in this component. So what I wanna put in here is an H1 that just says movie journal. Save it, and we can see it pop up here on the screen. So what's the first thing that we want to do? The first thing we should be able to do is to add new movie, because we can't really show a list of movies or be able to search through movies unless we at least have some movies input. So the first thing we should do is create a component that allows us to add new movies. So I'm gonna go back to my project, and I'm gonna go inside of my source folder and create a new file. I'm gonna call this movie input.svelte. Now, .svelte is the file extension that Svelte uses. And if you're using VS Code, go to your extensions and type in Svelte. It's recommended that you get Svelte for VS Code and Svelte IntelliSense. Go ahead and install those if you don't have those. That way, VS Code knows that you're working with Svelte. So inside of our movie input, what we want to do is create an actual input. I'm going to give it a placeholder of movie title, and this input is supposed to be type equals text. I'm gonna put these on separate lines for better readability. And we wanna add two things here. We wanna add a value for the input, and we also wanna add an onKeyUp event. Because every time you type in and lift your finger off of a key, you want to update the value that you assign here. But we don't have a value yet. We need to add some JavaScript. So to do that, we just create a script tag. And inside of here, we can just write vanilla JavaScript. So I'm gonna create a variable called title and set it equal to an empty string. And now I can set the value of my input equal to title. But we need a way to update this title. To do that, we need to actually access an event on the input called keyUp. And to do that, we're gonna put on and then a colon followed by the name of the event, which is keyUp. Now, we can use curly braces here, just like we did in the value, to set the onKeyUp to some JavaScript value that we've defined in our script here. Now, we don't have one yet, so let's create a function called onTitleChange. Now, I'm gonna use arrow functions, ES6 arrow functions, but you can write this in any function syntax you prefer. So I'm gonna create a const called onTitleChange, and instead of these empty parentheses here, I actually want to accept the event. And this is the keyUp event, because the keyUp event is gonna pass the event to whatever function we give it here automatically. And that's why we're accepting it here. So what I wanna do is set the title equal to the event.target.value. So now we can put onTitleChange here and save. And now whenever we type, it's going to update the title. Now another thing we need to have here is a select box where they can choose their rating on a scale of 1 to 5 for the movie. So I need to create a new variable called rating and set it equal to 1 initially. But I'm also going to need a select, and I'm gonna put this underneath the input here. And this is just normal HTML, and there's going to be 5 options. There's gonna be 5 in total. Now each of these is gonna have a value, and the value is gonna be equal to whatever number we pass in here. So let's say we have 5 options, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I'm gonna paste them below and change each one accordingly. So now I have this. If I save it and go back to my HTML file here, you can see nothing's here. We wanna see what we're writing here in the DOM so that we can make sure that we are updating everything correctly. If I can't see this in the browser, then I have no idea if it's working as I expected. So how can I use this component in my app component? Well, we have to import it, and anytime you do an import or write any JavaScript whatsoever, it needs to go inside of a script tag. So let's start by importing it. So import movie input from // because it's inside of the same directory as this file, movie input.svelte. Now we have access to our movie input. Let's go ahead and use it underneath our h1 tag here in our div, just like that. If I go back to the browser, you can see it's not working. And you can see in this terminal here that I basically broke the app. The reason why is because it's a default export, and I used curly braces here. So I have to remove the curly braces and use the import like this. Now I can save. And now you see the input and the select that we just created. Now, this select doesn't currently do anything. It's just a HTML select. We haven't hooked up any JavaScript functionality whatsoever to it. So that's what we need to do now. We need to create another function here, and I'll put it underneath my onTitleChange function, and it's gonna be very similar. I'm gonna call this function onRatingSelect, and it's also going to accept the event. And what it's gonna do is it's gonna set the rating equal to e.target.value. So it's extremely similar to this. The only difference is we're setting the rating instead of the title. Now, inside of my select tag, I wanna go ahead and set the value equal to the rating. And I want to, whenever I change this, I want to run onRatingSelect. So we can use on colon followed by the event name, which is going to be change. And then in curly braces, I want to pass in my onRatingSelect function. Now, as you can see here, I'm getting a yellow squiggly line, and it says onBlur must be used instead of onChange. Now, this is actually a problem with the linter. This is not a problem with Svelte. You can ignore this. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna write a comment above this to ignore this, and I'm gonna show you something in just a moment here. So above this, I want you to write this comment here that says Svelte ignore A11Y no on change. As you can see, it gets rid of the compiler warning. Now just to show you a couple of things, if I go to the web browser and we go to Svelte's official documentation, you can see that there's a select box here, and the way that they've written it is using onChange. So you know this is the official way to use it. And if we go to this GitHub issue here on Svelte, if we scroll all the way to the bottom, you can see that this is the solution that was offered here by this person. So that's what we're doing. This is a problem with the linter, and unfortunately this just happens from time to time, and as of the recording of this video, this problem exists. So we put this comment here. If you don't get the squiggly lines or any sort of compiler warnings, then you can just simply ignore this comment. Hopefully they fix it in the future. Cool. So I've set up my select box here, and I've set up my input, and I've got functions for both of these. The last thing we need to do in this file is set up the button to submit whatever we've entered in here. So below the select box, I'm going to create a button. The text for the button will be submit. And I want to set a couple of things. I want to set a disabled attribute, and I want to set an on-click event. Now, the disabled attribute is going to be set whenever the input is not valid, because we don't want to submit a movie if there is no movie title entered. So what we'll do is we'll set the disabled attribute equal to, and then in our curly braces, we can put a little bit of JavaScript. And I'm going to set it equal to not title, because if the title doesn't exist, then this will be true. And we're going to set disabled to true if the title doesn't exist. So the button will be disabled if we have yet to enter in a title. And this title is this variable that we're setting up here that gets updated every time we key up on the input. So by default, since it's an empty string, the button should be disabled. So let's have a look at it. As you can see here, the button is kind of grayed out. That means it's disabled. If I type in here, you can see that it just enabled. And as I backspace and clear out the input, it's now disabled again. But now I need an on-click function. And I'm going to call this function submit movie. And I'm going to put it underneath the on rating select. So const on, I'm just going to call it submit movie. Const submit movie, create my arrow function. And what we want to do, if there's a title, is we want to send out an event to the parent component. So since the app.svelte file is what is using this movie input component, what we want to do is listen for an event here on the movie input component. And whenever we submit a movie, we want to run that event, and we're going to call it with the movie that we submitted. And then after that, we're going to clear the input and the select box. So in order, we're going to submit a movie, we're going to run this function, we're going to call an event with the movie that we created, and then we're going to clear the input and the select box. So how can we do that? Well, Svelte offers us a function called create event dispatcher, and we can import it just like this from Svelte. So go ahead and import that. Then we have to actually create a dispatch. And below this, I'll create a dispatch by setting it equal to create event dispatcher, followed by an open and closing parenthesis. So with this dispatch, I can actually dispatch events. And that's what I'm going to do. But I'm going to only do it if title exists, because we don't want to submit a movie if somehow the user has gone into the DOM and enabled the button. We don't want to submit this movie unless the title exists. So how do we dispatch an event? Well, we'll just call dispatch. The first argument is the name of the event, which we're going to just call submit movie. And the second argument is an object with data inside of it that we want to send with the event. And we want to send a movie. So I'm creating a property called movie, and this is going to have both the title and the rating. And that is it. But if you remember, the next step is to clear the input. So I'm going to set title equal to an empty string and then rating back to 1, because that's what we initialized it as up here. So I'm going to save it. Now, how do we use this event? It's very simple. Just like the other events, we can put an on and then a colon and then whatever we named that event, which in this case is submit movie. And then we can run JavaScript whenever we submit a movie. Now I'm going to create a function inside of my script here, inside of my app.svelte, that we will run whenever we submit a movie. In other words, whenever the movie input calls the on submit movie event. I'm going to call this function submit movie. And this is actually going to accept a movie object. So I'm putting movie here because it's going to accept a movie as its argument. And here I just want to simply console.log the movie to make sure that everything's working good. So I have to put submit movie here. So as you can see, on submit movie, we call submit movie, and this submit movie is the one we're defining here. And this one is the one we're defining inside of the movie input. So I'll save it, and I've got my console window open here, and I'll type in a movie here, the Onion movie. And I'm gonna give it a rating of 5 and click submit. Looks like nothing's happening. And the reason why nothing's happening is because inside of our movie input.svelte, if we go back down to our button, we're not calling our submit movie function on click. So we need to do that really quick. So on :click, and we need to call our on submit movie function. Actually, it's just submit movie, just like this. Now, if we save it and go back to the browser, we can try this again. The Onion movie, give it a 5, click submit. Now you can see something logs on the right here. Let's have a look. If we open this up, there's a detail attribute, and this is where our movie exists in the object that we're passing inside of our app.svelte file. That is what this is. But we don't want it to be that. We want the movie to be the actual movie. So what I'm gonna do here is instead of just passing in the submit movie function, I'm gonna pass in a arrow function, which takes the event and then calls the submit movie function with event.detail.movie. So if I go back now and try to run it, the onion movie, give it a 5, click submit. Now what gets logged is the actual movie itself. I think that's a lot cleaner and better. But obviously, we don't want to just log the movie. We want to actually add it to a list of movies that we're keeping track of. How can we do that? How are we going to store these movies? We're going to use local storage to store our movies. So when we get to this point right here, when we're submitting a movie, we've already determined that title exists, and we've got a rating, we've got the full movie object. What is it we want to do now? We want to store the new movie in local storage. But right now, we don't have a movie's local storage. We don't have anything in local storage. So we need to check to ensure that something exists in local storage. If it doesn't, we need to create it. So let's just see what this logic is going to look like. We need to keep track of a variable called movies. And we need to initialize it as soon as the component loads. And when the component loads, we want to get local storage and set it equal to movies. However, if local storage doesn't have anything called movies, we need to set movies to an empty array, because that means we don't have any movies stored. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create a variable called movies, and then I'm gonna use a ternary operator to run some conditional logic. So we're gonna check and see if we have anything in local storage called movies. If we do have something in local storage called movies, we're gonna json.parse that and set it equal to movies. However, if this ends up being false, in other words, we don't have any local storage movies, we're gonna set movies equal to an empty array. So now as this component initializes, we have a variable called movies, which is either an empty array or an array of movies. So now what we can do is create a variable inside of our submit movie function that's getting called updated movies. And we wanna update our movies array with the new movie. So I'm gonna use the spread operator to set it equal to movies along with the current movie that we're passing in here. So as you can see, we're passing in movie, and we're creating a variable called updated movies with all of the movies that exist so far with the additional movie as well. Now, what we wanna do is local storage.set item, and the item is movies. That's the key we're gonna use for local storage. And we wanna set a string, so we're gonna stringify this object here, this array. We're gonna stringify this using json.stringify, and we're gonna pass in updated movies. So now we're creating a variable called updated movies, and then we're setting that updated movies variable in our local storage. And then finally, we're gonna set movies equal to updated movies as well. Updated movies. So I'm gonna rename this variable to updated movies because that's what I meant to call it. Update it in all 3 places. And now I'm going to save. So when I call this submit movie function now, we should see a movie get added to local storage. So I'm gonna add the onion movie, give it a rating of 5, and click submit. Now you can see the input was cleared. Let's see if we have anything in local storage. So I'm using Google Chrome. Over here on my application tab, you can see that I have a local storage menu item, and I can click the localhost 5000 item here. Now you can see there's a movies key, and over here the value contains the onion movie with a rating of 5. So it looks like it's submitted properly. So the next step is probably gonna be to go ahead and display the list of movies underneath of this. So let's create a new component inside of our source folder called movielist.svelte. Now this is going to take a prop. And if you remember in the app.svelte file, to accept a prop inside of the component that receives the props, you have to basically define it like this. You have to declare it by exporting a let and then the name of the variable. Now, inside of my app.svelte file, these two that we were talking about at the beginning of the tutorial, I'm gonna go ahead and remove those. And inside of my main.js file, I'm gonna remove this props object completely because I don't really wanna pass anything into the app component. So in order to pass a prop into a component, we're gonna want to use the component itself, but we have to import it. Remember to import it. So I'm just gonna copy this line and paste it underneath here. And instead of movie input, it's movie list. And we have to change it here as well. And then I'm going to use the component underneath my movie input. So movie list, and we're gonna pass in a prop. And that prop is going to be called movies. And we're gonna set it equal to movies, just like this. So now inside of my movie list.svelte file, I need to say export let movies, just like that. Now, what we want to do in our HTML section of this file is basically loop through our movies, and for every single movie that exists, we want to create a div with information about that movie. So how do we loop in Svelte? Well, it's actually pretty easy. What we want to do is have two sets of curly braces. Okay, so two sets. Inside of the first set, we're going to add a hashtag and add each. And this is saying we're going to loop, basically like for each. The second thing we want to say is movies. So each is saying we want to loop. Movies is saying what we want to loop through. We want to loop through movies. And we want to call each movie that we find in the loop every time we iterate through movies. Each iteration is going to be a movie, and we're going to call that movie. And we can reference it in JavaScript as movie, as if it's a variable. And then finally, we want to add two parentheses here and say movie.title. And this is going to be the key that we use, that the unique identifier for each movie. If we don't add this, then we're going to get functionality that we might not expect. So go ahead and add this as well. And then what we want to add in the second set of curly braces is /each. Now anything between this is going to be inside of our loop. And like I said, for every single movie, we want to create a new div with information about that movie. And all we want to add is an H3 with the movie title. So we can add some curly braces to put some JavaScript, and I'm going to say movie.title. And then below this, we want to add a paragraph tag that just says your rating, followed by the actual movie rating, which is movie.rating. Cool. I saved it, and now we should be able to see this in the browser. And I do. But we only have one movie. So let's add another movie really quick. So I'm actually going to add a total of 3 movies because I think it would look better and we'll be able to have better searchability later on. So I'm going to go ahead and add them now. So the first one I'll add is Old Boy. Really good movie. You should totally watch it. The third one I'm going to add is Parasite. So now I've added 3 movies, and you can see that they're all 3 being displayed underneath here inside of our movie list component. Now the final bit of functionality that we're going to add to this is searchability. We want to add a search bar above this so that we can search through our movies. That way, once we have tons of movies, we can easily find the ones that we're looking for. Before I dive into that, I want to go ahead and add a little bit of styling. So what I'll do is go back to my project here. I'm going to go ahead and start by hopping into my movie input.svelte file. And as you can see, we don't have any styles yet. So you can put these anywhere you want, but I'm going to throw it here at the bottom, a couple of style tags. And I'm just going to put in a little bit of styling. Now, if you look at the top here, we don't have a container for our input and our select and our button. So I'm going to cut all of this and put all of this inside of a div container. And I'm going to give this div container a class called main. And now I can select it like this. I'm going to set the width to 100%. And I'm going to give it a display of flex. Now I want to select the input. So I'm going to say main input, just like that, and set the flex to 1. Then I want to select the select, and I want to make the width 75 pixels. I want to set the margin right to 10 pixels, but I also want to set the margin left to 10 pixels as well. And then finally, I want to select the button and just give it a width of 75 pixels so that it matches the select's width. Save it. Now, what's going to happen is it's going to get really big. So what I want to do is take the container that's holding all of this and style that as well. So inside of our app.svelte file over here, let's hop into our styles, and I've got this .main here. Now, if you remember, I've got this div with a class of main that I changed at the beginning. I want to go ahead and style that main now. Let's set the width to 500 pixels. But if they're on mobile, then we don't really want that to be 500 pixels because if their screen is, say, 400 pixels wide, then it's going to break out of the screen. So I'm going to set a max width underneath to be 100%. That way, the maximum the width will ever be is 100% of the screen. Now, I'm going to go ahead and set the padding to 1 EM, and I'm going to set the margin to auto. The text align should also be centered. And let's see what this looks like. That's a lot better so far. Now, as for the movie list, I kind of want the movie list to be text align left. So I'm going to run into my movie list and create a style tag here. And I'm going to select the div and just set the text align to left. Save that. And that looks a bit better in my opinion. Now, each of these could probably use like a border bottom to just show a little bit more separation between them. So that's what I'll do. I'll set a padding bottom of 10 pixels, followed by a border bottom of 1 pixel solid black. And now there's a little bit more separation between each of the movies. Looks pretty good. So that's it for the styling here. Let's go ahead and add our search bar. Okay, so inside of my source folder, I'll create a new file called search.svelte. And then inside of here, I'm gonna create an input with a placeholder equal to search your movies. Now I'm gonna put this on a separate line just so that it's clean and you can see it a little bit more easily. And I need to put a value and an onKeyUp function just like we did in the movie input. So I'm gonna go ahead and write the value here and set it equal to search term, which does not exist yet, but we'll create it in just a moment. And let's go ahead and set up the onKeyUp as well. And we're gonna call a function called search, which does not exist yet. So let's go ahead and add both of those. Create a script tag above here. And let's create a variable called search term and initialize it as an empty string. We're also gonna need a search function. So const search. And this is going to take the onKeyUp event. So accept the event here. And what do we wanna do? Well, let's set the search term, this variable here, let's go ahead and set that equal to the event.target.value. So whatever we end up typing in here, we're gonna go ahead and set the search term equal to that. Now, if the search term exists, in other words, if it's not empty, if we didn't backspace it and clear out the input, then we want to dispatch something. However, if you remember, we have to import the functionality for dispatching, which is this right here. So import create event dispatcher from Svelte and then create a dispatch from that, just like we did in the movie input. So what we want to do is if search term exists, we want to go ahead and dispatch event, and the event, we're going to call it search. We need to pass in some data to this event, and we'll just simply pass in the search term. So that's if the search term exists. However, if it does not exist, we just want to dispatch a different event, and we're going to call this event clear search, and we're just going to pass it in an empty object. And finally, the last thing we want to add is a little bit of styles. I'm just going to give it the input here a width of 100%. And that's it. So we need to actually use this search component inside of our app component. And I think it would look best above the movie input. So search, and make sure that you import search from here, just like the other components. And if you remember, this search has two events that we want to listen to. We want to listen to both clear search and search. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with clear search. So on clear search, what do we want to do? We want to call a function called clear search. However, we need to define that function, and we can define that in our script tag. So const clear search, and it really doesn't need to accept any arguments because we're only going to do one thing whenever we clear the search, and that is reinitialize movies. Now, in the beginning, this is how we're initializing movies, right? We're using that ternary operator that we talked about. We want to just set that back equal to that initial value. So the best way to do that is to just copy this code right here and paste it into the clear search functionality. But now we need an actual search function. And we have that event. We're dispatching the event inside of search every single time we type in the input. So every time we type in the input, we're going to search and filter the results. So we need to create a function here called search. Now, this one is going to take the search term. So the search term is being accepted here as the argument for search. What do we want to do? Well, we want to set movies to a new value because movies is what's being passed into the movie list here. And that's controlling what we see underneath the movie input. That movie list is controlling what we see here. And whenever we type into here, we want to filter these results to only include the values that have the search term that we're typing in here. So how do we do that? Well, we want to set movies equal to a new value, and we want to grab the value from local storage. So whatever value is in local storage for movies here, we want to parse that out. So json.parse local storage.getItem movies, and we want to call filter on that because this is an array. This will be an array right here, provided it exists. But if you remember, there's a chance that this doesn't exist because it could be the very first time we're using the application. And therefore, this would end up being undefined, and we can't run array logic on something that's undefined. So we have to do this again. But what we're going to do is we're going to assign it to a variable that we're going to keep temporarily called temp movies. And we're going to go ahead and assign it to that. So instead of this, we're going to use temp movies, just like this. So I'll put a line in here so you can see the clear separation. So currently temp movies is whatever's in local storage. However, if there is nothing in local storage, it's just going to be an empty array. So what we want to do is set movies equal to temp movies.filter. We want to filter through these temp movies and set the result of that equal to movies, okay? So for each temp movie, we're going to assign a variable called m. And for each one, we want to take the title of that, m.title.to lowercase. We want to get the lowercase version of that title and see if that string happens to include, that's what we're adding here, is this includes, we want to see if it includes our search term .to lowercase. So let's see if I can add this on a separate line to just make it a little bit more clean for you so you can see it all on the screen at once. So we're just setting movies equal to temp movies.filter, and then we're just checking to see if the lowercase version of the title includes the search term to lowercase. And that happens every time we call search. But we need to actually listen for the event here. So on search, we're going to call search, but we want to do what we did here and take the event. If you remember, on our custom events, we need to pull out the event.detail. Whatever it is. In our case, it's going to be search term. So we'll call search with event.detail.search term. And let's see what happens when we try this functionality out. Let's search for old boy. As I type in old, you can see old boy is the only result left. And I'll start to backspace, and you can see that two movies have the letter O in it, and then when I backspace completely, we're calling the clear input function. So now we're back to the full list of movies. So now we are able to search through our movies. So if I type in Y, you can see that only one of the titles has Y in the name, and then when I backspace out, we get all of the results back. So now we have a fully working, very basic movie journal that we can use, and we built it using Svelte. I hope you all enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you all learned a lot. If you learned something, please let me know in the comments. If you didn't learn something, please also let me know in the comments. And do me a favor and smash that like button for me. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next tutorial.